Hello, I am here. This is Paul Gessing. I'm here with Philip K. Howard. He is chairman of the board and of the Common Good Foundation. He's also senior counsel at Covington and Burling. He started, I believe, Common Good, and say nonpartisan reform coalition with one basic goal: to reform the freedom of officials and citizens to use common sense. It's an organization active here in the United States in the political sphere, but working with both sides of the aisle. Advisory board members include Bill Bradley, Alan Simpson, and Tom Keene. They have offices in New York and Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to have Philip K. Howard here today to discuss Common Good, its efforts to unite a divided country. And welcome to New Mexico virtually, Mr. Howard.
Nice to be with you. You know, I've been in most states. I'm so old, but I don't think I've ever been to New Mexico. It's really my loss. I know it's so beautiful.
Well, when this whole COVID nightmare is behind us, maybe we'll have to do something to get you out to New Mexico to share a little bit about what you're trying to do to reform and improve American politics. In your mission statement, you talk about the alienation and pent-up frustration most people have, and we're still kind of in the aftermath of the presidential election. Biden has said he won. President Trump has said not so fast. And, we're kind of in that phase right now. The media, of course, are pushing very hard for President Trump to concede. But we're not really going to get caught up in the red team, blue team sort of thing here. You lay out principles for good governance. And, I presume you're predominantly working at the national level, and so we can definitely talk about that. But of course, the Rio Grande Foundation is New Mexico's free market policy think tank, and we also care deeply about reforms at the state and local level. So let's start the discussion, though, with what you're doing nationally and how you want to see the federal government work a lot differently than what it does today.
Well, I think it's not just federal government. I mean, these problems apply to states as well, as you well know. We think the legacy bureaucracies that have been built up mainly since the 1960s are terminally paralytic. They, doctors spend 2 hours in desk work for every hour they spend with patients. Teachers can't maintain order in a classroom. The regulatory overload for small businesses is literally beyond any human's comprehension. You can never know all the law, much less comply with it. So we have this system of government that's kind of grown up. Really, nobody designed it. It just sort of accreted, since the 1960s, and it drives people crazy. It doesn't work. It's ruinously expensive. I mean, it's just ruinously expensive. I mean, it's actually, well, a few facts. We now spend almost a third of the healthcare dollar on administration. That's $1 trillion or $1 million per doctor. About half of that, some of that's needed, but maybe a quarter of it or a fifth of it. A lot of it's in fee-for-service paperwork, but a lot of it is in kind of regulatory micromanagement, privacy laws, incredibly granular rules, again, that people can't keep up with. Half the states in this country now have more non-instructional personnel in their school systems than they do teachers. What are they doing? They're filling out reports aimed at making schools work better. And of course, the effect is to make schools work worse. Because all people are focusing on complying with the rules or filling out the forms instead of, figuring out ways to teach the children. So everything's broken about government, and everyone sort of knows it. There's a poll last year, AP University of Chicago poll, 2/3 of Americans think the government needs major structural changes. But we just came out of an election cycle where there was virtually nothing about this in the debate, nothing about making government work better. It's the same as like trench warfare. And on the right, you've got people saying, just get rid of government, which hasn't really happened. And then on the left, you've got all the loonies on the left, preaching literally socialism. It's like, instead of driving people into the arms of the other side. So our challenge is trying to get the debate focused on sort of blocking and tackling, which is, let's just think about now, how do we actually make healthcare affordable? How do we actually make schools work? How do we make it so that you can get a permit to fix a broken bridge or something in 6 months or a year instead of 10 years?
Well, your statements, and I'm a pretty libertarian guy running a free market conservative think tank in New Mexico here, and your statements and your website definitely lay out a lot of that kind of anti-bureaucracy rhetoric and statements. And President Trump certainly took on a lot of regulatory issues. We're in an oil and gas producing state, and that was one of the industries that really benefited, I think, from some of Trump's deregulation. Obviously, your goals are more ambitious and kind of even broader, but I would say that we either try to do too much using government, or we have a political class that likes to create new jobs for themselves. And getting into the kind of political science aspect of all this, how do you actually address those issues and either restore or better yet eliminate some of those government programs and the jobs that unfortunately come with them?
I wrote a book that came out last year called Try Common Sense. And one of the recommendations in the book was to move the national capital. And what I argued is that it's in an age of instant communications, you don't need everybody to be in Washington. And Washington really ought to get broken up. You can move the Department of the Interior to New Mexico. You can move, education somewhere else. Because Washington really is its own, as you point out, its own culture, and it's a culture of self-preservation. It's a culture of the status quo. I think that, just to make this more interesting, I think to sort of pick a fight, I think that the way that one needs to go at this is not to focus mainly on getting rid of government, although God knows there's a lot that isn't needed. I mean, they're like, 26 different job training programs. There's all this stuff that's piled up. It makes no sense whatsoever. There are lots of obsolete laws, and we have a proposal on cleaning out that. But, I think you get a lot more buy-in from people if the first piece of the agenda is just to make whatever government does work sensibly. And the way government oversees schools or healthcare or worker safety, I mean, you name it, it's just not sensible. Nobody can use their common sense. Everybody's sitting there, filling out forms all day long instead of doing their jobs. And so there are about 150 million words of binding federal law and regulation. And most of that regulation is not actually setting a goal. Like, I bet most Americans would say, yeah, we should have reasonably safe workplaces. We're not going to leave it to the tort system to, regulate small machine shops or whatever. I suspect. But having 4,000 rules, things like stairwells shall be lit by natural or artificial light, it's just not helpful. It's just, it's like workplaces should have oxygen. I mean, it's not, it's like, so we have these kind of idiotic, granular rules. There's a rule for an apple orchard that you have to cover the apples after they're picked. And they're in the cart and going to the barn to be washed. You got to cover them with a cloth to protect them against bird droppings. Well, those apples have been growing on the tree for 5 months, and nobody in the government's been protecting them against bird droppings. So there's a kind of a granularity here that's just idiotic. It has nothing to do with the goal of clean apples or having stairwells lit, have the goal of worker safety. You don't need that. And so I think it's important when we're cleaning stuff out to is to acknowledge that there are roles for government in a crowded society, but they need to honor common sense, and they don't. They just drive everyone nuts.
Okay, well, kind of looking at this from a political, historical approach, interestingly enough, I consider Donald Trump to be the most notable deregulation president in my lifetime, with the exception of Jimmy Carter. When I was a young child, he was the president, and don't remember much of that era, but I've looked at the history books and know that Jimmy Carter, did a great deal to deregulate the airline industry, trucking, railroads,
Right.
even getting the craft brewing industry going by deregulating that. And we know Jimmy Carter was a one-termer, of course, a Democrat. We know that Trump is looking like a one-termer. So it seems like, deregulation doesn't fly very far with the voters, because I would agree with deregulation. When it comes to cutting taxes, there are costs and benefits to that, but when it comes to deregulation, it seems like it's 95% benefits and very little in the way of real costs on most of these things. But the politics don't necessarily work out like you and I would like, as it seems.
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter also proposed sunset laws so that laws would automatically expire, every few years, so they have to be reissued. We launched a campaign for common good this summer with a petition calling for spring cleaning commissions, because every single program is broken. But I don't agree that 95% of the programs need to be abolished altogether. I think we need environmental laws to protect clean air and clean water. And
I'm referring to the regulations, not necessarily the laws.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Well, see, I don't really distinguish between the two. I think when it comes to regulations, their bigger problem is their granularity. So in my universe, it would be, I'll give an example. Australia, a couple of decades ago, had terrible nursing homes, just as the US generally had terrible nursing homes. And they had this thick rule book that, told everybody exactly how to decorate the rooms and, how many hours between meals. It's very granular. Someone had the bright idea of throwing the rule book away and replacing it with 31 general principles. Have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents. These are sort of goal, general goal type things. And the experts on both sides scoff, saying, well, this is crazy, regulators will go wild, or the nursing home owners will go wild. a year later, they went in to investigate how it worked. It turns out the nursing homes were twice as good. And they investigated, well, why is that? And the reason is because people came to work not focusing on compliance, but focusing on the residents. What does this resident need? What does she need or want today and whatever? And the general principles allowed for innovation, allowed for exceptions. You didn't have to do things in the kind of one size fits all kind of way. And the regulators didn't give up their power, but everyone had to kind of argue their point. And so if people had a disagreement, which happened all the time, they'd periodically get together, and the stakeholders and the nursing home owners and the regulator would get together and they'd work it out or not. And if there was a disagreement about what the regulator decided, then it could be appealed up the line to the supervisor or to a court. But that didn't happen very often because people worked it out. And so what happened is, if you set goals, and most people agree on goals, if you set goals and let people kind of use their common sense and let them argue about it, then things work out better. We've created a system like in schools because of teachers' unions and other things. No one has any authority to work anything out. Principals don't run the schools. The collective bargaining agreement runs the schools. We've disempowered everybody, and not surprisingly, it doesn't work.
Right. I totally agree. And yeah, I wasn't necessarily talking about just letting businesses completely manage environmental regulations, for example, but rather some of the individual regulations that become too much, even for environmentalists. They see them as over.
Yeah, they're crazy. I mean, I've written about this. I mean, if you have a rule that tells you exactly how to catch the pollution, most of the time it will either not catch the pollution, or it will make some business spend $30 million to catch an ounce of something when they could have, caught a lot more doing something different. I mean, I work with Clinton and Gore on the Reinventing Government initiative, and one of our reforms was to allow the EPA to waive rules if there was a better way of regulating. It didn't actually get used much. I tried to go all the way to having a much more goal-oriented structure, but believe it or not, I was the group that stopped it were the business lobbies, because they said they wanted to be told exactly what to do. And I was sitting, a couple of months later, I was having at a lunch at the White House, and I was sitting next to some guy I didn't know. He turned out to be the CEO of DuPont. So I said, well, what would you think of a system where, and I described a system, more like the Australian nursing homes, where there was presumptive limits, but there was a right to, argue about doing it in a better way and such. And he said, I would take that in an instant, because 3/4 of the time, the rules make no sense for the public. Not only are they expensive for the DuPont company, they're not helping the public, or they're harming the public. And I could sit down with the regulator and work it out, but the law doesn't let us do that.
So in New Mexico, and I definitely want to talk again about national, but we have something called a renewable portfolio standard, and it mandates certain progressions in terms of the decline of CO2 emissions. So might an example of what you're referring to be, rather than prescribing wind, solar, et cetera, say, here's the goals that we have in mind, innovate and try to figure out the best ways to do it. And from our perspective, that might include, instead of saying you do zero carbon emissions, you instead use nuclear to get to the zero carbon
Sure,
emissions.
sure. And put in or do it with carbon taxes, so that the market really does control it. I mean, I'm with you. I'm a pro-nuclear person. There are these small, less expensive nuclear modules now that are apparently incredibly efficient, and extremely environmentally friendly. And I have my first job was at the Oak Ridge National Lab, so I'm not one of these people who's terrified of nuclear power. I think it's incredibly efficient if you put in the adequate safeguards. It's it's better for everyone, particularly better for the environment.
No doubt about it. Now, of course, we are looking at a President Biden administration, and back to your point about President Clinton and even at least Al Gore as vice president. Who knows what he would have been like as president, but certainly the Clinton administration took the size of government operations very seriously. It doesn't seem like, quite frankly, either political party in Washington takes those issues very seriously. But Biden more than likely will be president. So talk about what you see as potential areas of making inroads and having successes with the Biden administration, and kind of where the Democratic Party is nowadays.
Well, first of all, that is the question of the day. Secondly, you're right that the parties are both dominated by groups that are not talking about what we're talking about. So the way I look at what we're doing is that we're looking at operating systems. We're not looking at policy. We're looking at operating systems. How do you make it so that a teacher can do the best job she can? How do you make it so that doctors and nurses can focus on patients, not on red tape? How do you make it so that you can rebuild broken infrastructure and get a permit in 6 months instead of 6 years or 10 years? And none of those things happen under the current framework because because conceptually what's happened is that law is supposed to be outer boundaries protecting against bad things. You can't pollute, you can't cheat, you can't commit crime. And then in between, it's supposed to be a field of freedom where people can innovate, do things they like, get along with people, don't get along with people, all that kind of stuff. What's happened in the last 50 years is that law has come into the field of freedom and told us how to do things correctly. And you can't fix that system. You have to abandon that system, not to change necessarily the goals, like getting rid of pollution, but to create an open framework that allows human beings to actually do the job in a sensible way, whether it's doctors, teachers, environmentalists, or whoever. So what we're trying to do is build a coalition of right and left designed to reboot the operating system and to build public pressure to do that. And so we're in the process of trying to build a critical mass of business leaders. We have leading experts in the country in healthcare and education and such who are signed up, but everybody knows the system's broken. But President Biden won't fix it unless there's a strong wind blowing in that direction. And I think it's at least possible that we could get a strong wind blowing in that direction that includes a lot of Democrats as well as most Republicans. But we need to change that narrative. So we need to get editorials writing that way. We need to get the Rio Grande Institute to talk about the need to reboot these systems. They're designed to fail. But the current political system is designed to preserve the status quo. if you look in Washington, changing the way bureaucracy works is not something that the public unions will support, right? Because
Mhm.
it's what they do. It's not something that the lobbyists and the lawyers will support. That's what they do. They're the mandarins of this really complicated system. So uh, this is not new to our time. Change always comes from the outside. Regime, ancient pharaohs, dictators. They're all developed. Political scientists call the phenomenon punctuated equilibrium. Things stay the same until finally they're just unsustainable and they crack and they fall virtually overnight. It happened with Ceausescu, the horrible Romanian dictator. He remained dictator decades after everyone hated him, and he still got away with it until finally one day in his public speech, somebody yelled out, "Down with the dictator, down with the tyrant," and the whole crowd picked up the chant. And he ran off stage, and he and his wife were executed, days later. So, we're at this point where it's sort of down with the dictator, except it's down with the bureaucracy. And
Well, I would postulate that getting rid of a dictator is easier than getting rid of bureaucracies or changing the way bureaucracies operate. And that seems to be kind of the critical question, because, obviously, our view is that a lot of what government does just shouldn't be done, at least the federal government. Other aspects of what government does should be truly done at the state level, and that includes the taxing and so funding of the operations, as well as the regulatory aspect of that operation. And that that's the way we reform. Now that's a radical agenda compared to where we are, but I'm not sure that you can change the way bureaucracies and the bureaucrats that populate them work, because they have so much tied into what they're doing, and they're very limited in their accountability. The way the system can be held accountable, they're less accountable than Ceausescu, in my opinion, because you don't even know who they are, and they have such power, and they're getting paid well, and all that kind of stuff. So, talk about kind of how you hold those bureaucracies accountable.
Okay. Well, first of all, it is a hard problem. So one of the things we've worked on is, and it's absolutely indispensable, is civil service reform. And what you want is not a civil service, in my view, where they come to work every day and fear that somebody's going to fire them, or, overnight, although you do need to get rid of bad people. But you want a system that attracts really good people, people who are smart and dedicated to public service, and they do need to be accountable. And you can put in speed bumps to make sure that the accountability is fair. The current system is completely unaccountable. It means zero. 99% of federal employees get a fully successful rating. Why is that? Because if they get anything less than a fully successful rating, they can file a grievance, and the supervisor has to go justify what he said, and it's not worth the trouble to go through a quote due process hearing to prove that somebody who's lazy is lazy, or whatever, or has bad judgment or whatever. So I did an analysis last year on the constitutionality of Congress imposing collective bargaining on the executive branch in the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. And I concluded, and now people are accepting that I'm correct, that it's clearly unconstitutional. So Trump's recent order, which I disagreed with the substance of, this Schedule F, where he would create thousands of people who would be fireable at will and hireable at will, people like Dr. Fauci, for example. But he based that analysis on my paper. and that he had the constitutional power to hold people accountable. And so I'm talking with a number of experts right now about how do we get civil service reform going so that you can actually hold people, you can actually attract good people because you give them more responsibility, but also have practical means of holding them accountable. I'm also working on a constitutional analysis of why the growth of collective bargaining at the state level of teachers and public employees is itself unconstitutional. Because it doesn't matter whom you elect. If you want to make the schools, I don't know about New Mexico, but in Colorado or some other place that has strong unions, because the union collective bargaining agreements don't let you manage it. And the same with the fiscal policy. So my view is to use the Supreme Court as the lever for overhauling the public employment structures that in part are to blame for all this bureaucracy, because when you can't hold people accountable, you have to have detailed rules that tell them exactly how to do things, because people won't let people have just unbridled power, right? You either have to hold them accountable or you're going to have shackle them with detailed rules. And the detailed rules don't work for the reasons I've argued about in a bunch of books. And so you've got to find accountability. So in any event, so that's one lever, is using the courts to dislodge them.
So you talk about Trump's executive order, and I'm not familiar with all the ins and outs of it, but it sounds like that he was removing some of the protections for bureaucrats in these agencies and giving more, he was trying to take more direct control over their hiring and firing from the executive. Is that how I understand it?
Yeah. Basically, he would take it was, I forget how many, 3,000 or 4,000 top civil servants, and declassify them and make them essentially at will employees, so that they would be more like political appointees, hireable and fireable at will. Mm-hmm. Most people I know think that there are too many political appointees, not too few, but too many. And I think that's probably right. There are like 11 layers of government. They're deputy, associate, assistant, chiefs of staff for some other chief of staff. Washington's just incredibly layered up. It needs to be much more horizontal. And people need to be able to shine the spotlight on somebody and say, is this the person in charge of these stupid decisions? So you can hold them accountable. But Trump did, I think the silver lining to what he did, which I didn't think was wise as an organizational device, is that he did, he has called the question on the constitutionality. And from my standpoint, that's useful because it raises, it raises the profile of, I'm the only person who's analyzed it, it raises the profile of that analysis. One of the problems, the reason civil service came in is because there was a spoils system where hacks got jobs. A train full of people would come in after the election, and all these, it'd be political appointees, and then a trainload of people would go out, and it made for a very inefficient government.
We're talking back to the 1800s.
We're talking 1883.
Mm-hmm.
So the Civil Service Reform Pendleton Act of 1883, it did not provide for tenure. You could lose your job readily. It was a system of neutral hiring. So instead of hiring political hacks to be the infectious disease expert, to use a current example, you hired somebody who was an expert in infectious diseases. And you went through a process that tried to get the best person possible. I completely agree with that. I don't want a political hack to be in charge of infectious diseases. So, but it got captured by the public employees. So eventually they got these collective bargaining rights. It's really only 45 years ago now.
That was Kennedy, right?
Well, the initial was an executive order with Kennedy, that's 60 years ago. You know, Executive Order 10988. And then that got codified into a statute under Carter.
So not all the good deregulatory Jimmy Carter there. He did that one, and that's not a good one.
Yeah, well, that was Congress. I don't know if you can blame Carter completely
Fair enough.
on that. You know, I mean, you know, it was a congressional act, and you know, the rights revolution. You know, people get overexcited, right? So you get these kind of tidal waves of emotion, and after the 60s, there was this tidal wave of people thinking that the way to look at government is through the lens of individual rights. Right? So everybody got individual rights to complain about anything. So let's just step back and pause for a second. Rights against what? It's rights against everybody else. You know, it's rights against supervisors. It's rights against the teacher, the principal. I mean, wait a minute. Their job is to run the classroom, not to have somebody prevent them from running the classroom. You know, so this modern idea of rights, I mean, it sounds so virtuous, right? I mean, Americans for rights. The rights are the opposite of rights. They're taking away everyone else's rights. The rights in the Constitution were rights against coercive state power. Government can't take your home away or you know, put you in jail without due process of law. You know, because the presumption is a free society and it's your property and it's your liberty. When you're talking about, to use a simple example, a teacher running a classroom, she's not exercising coercive power. Her job is to run the classroom. Her job is to keep order. Her job is to make sure it all works. It's not to give some misbehaving student the right to pull the rug out from under her.
Well, we only have a few minutes remaining, and I kind of want to give you the opportunity to share any other information about what your organization is doing that we haven't talked about. Again, it's commongood.org, so folks can find it there along with a lot of information, a petition, the platform, some of the other people involved, social media accounts, etc. But any other you know, topics or any other brief items you want to bring up?
Well, I was just saying that if people can sign up for, you know, for what we're doing, it's free. But you know, I think it's really useful to bring the problems of modern government down to the ground level, which I know you do as well. And these systems shouldn't be fixed just because in an abstract theoretical way, they don't make any sense, which is also true. But people need to get involved in fixing them and telling their neighbors and getting involved, because it makes it impossible to do things in our own lives. I mean, people in America don't even feel free to be themselves. You know, we go through the day asking ourselves, can I prove that what I'm about to say or do is legally correct? You know, we've been trained now to feel insecure about having opinions and free choice. It's literally crazy. You know, we need to have a discussion about what it means to be free as you walk down the street, you know, and you interact with people in the workplace. And I think when you bring things down to a concrete level about how the school works or the hospital works or really anything works, how the police work, it's really, the solutions aren't actually all that hard, you know, but they require giving people, whether it's the police chief or the principal of the school or the judge or whomever, requires having those people have the freedom to use their judgment and to try to meet the public goals and to be accountable But we've made governing a lot harder than it is. We do have way too much of it, which I know you're, a big critic of, and I agree with that. So we definitely need a spring cleaning, but we also need to kind of bring it down to a human level and let people do their jobs again. And I think there's an opportunity if we could somehow get this as part of the national discussion. I think it's enormously unifying. Most people are angry because of the stupidities in their own lives. The stupidity of feeling not being able to be themselves, or the schools don't work, or whatever. And if we can make things start to work again, then maybe the polarization would calm down, and we could actually debate these things in a coherent way. But at the moment, everything's broken, and you get all these extremist solutions, and they're not going to go anywhere. So I think there's a vacuum, and we're trying to fill it, and we'd love to work with you guys to try to fill it in New Mexico.
All right. Thank you, Philip K. Howard. Again, it is commongood.org. You can find information there, including the petition to sign to support his efforts. Thanks for your time today. And hopefully someday soon, when the COVID is not as big of a deal, or it's done, we'll get you out to New Mexico, and you can knock off whatever the 50th or 49th, make it your 49th or 50th state to come
Yeah,
to.
exactly. Great. All right. Nice talking with you, Paul.
No problem. Thank you.